Should you buy Assassin's Creed 3 in 2021? Assassin's Creed 3 when released was criticised by critics and fans alike, all varying from the pacing, performance and bug issues, but how many of those issues have been fixed in the last 9 years? Is Assassin's Creed 3 really worth buying in 2021 when so many other sequels and games are sold at the same price? Let's get into this. We'll be talking narrative and gameplay. Assassin's Creed 3 begins right at the end of Assassin's Creed Revelations, and it's immediately clear what's been changed visually due to the new engine Ubisoft created called Anvil Next. Visually, Assassin's Creed 3 is far ahead of the previous games, but a lot of colour was lost, which immediately put me off. But you know, that is a personal nitpick. We jump straight into the main narrative following a new character called Haytham, and while this isn't a spoiler review, but no matter how many updates are made, you can't fix narrative structure. And man, I have to be honest, the pacing and structure of the story here sucks. I'm usually quite nice to Assassin's Creed games due to their open world design, but my god, I didn't remember the pacing being this bad. It takes almost 4 to 5 hours roughly to actually meet the main assassin Connor, and even then every tutorial you've done in the last 4 to 5 hours you have to repeat with the new main character, but we'll get into that in the gameplay section. So the main themes this narrative explores is loyalty, family, revenge, and well, most importantly, morality. Morality kind of sums it up quite well. It's all told through the backdrop of the American Revolution, but that really does come to the detriment of the narrative. Let me explain. Everything in the story has to connect with the Revolutionary War, whereas previous entries mainly use the period it was set in as a backdrop to tell the bigger narrative with the modern day and the various plot points that come with that. But Assassin's Creed 3 has its main character involved with so many historic events, it kind of overpowers the narrative actually being told by just putting you in these events, because it feels like the story has been written primarily just to put you in these historical battles rather than to actually tell a unique story exclusive to the characters we are following. This is also because of pacing. We don't become a full-on assassin hunting targets until Sequence 6, and Sequence 6 is halfway through the game that's called Assassin's Creed 3, which means the story now has nowhere near the amount of time needed to flesh out this character, and even less so for the supporting cast, and it really does affect the story in a negative way. It's hard to care about characters we barely know, like Achilles, who just happens to be around and leads Connor on his journey as an assassin, but nothing else is really fleshed out, and Achilles' ending comes through a side mission which just blew me away, and not in a good way. It's not terrible though, the voice acting here is actually superb most of the time, even when the characters we are following aren't that likeable like Connor, but the voice actor who plays him absolutely nailed what kind of person Connor would actually be. A bitter, angry and desperate person to find meaning in his life and the answers that come from that. So I don't not like Connor, but he ain't someone you would sit down and have a pint with, if you understand what I mean.
Who are you to lecture anyone? You locked yourself away in this crumbling heap and gave up on the Brotherhood entirely. Since the day I arrived, you've done nothing but discourage me. And on the rare occasions you've chosen to help, you've done so little, you may as well have done nothing at all. How dare you!
The modern day here is average at best. It completes the story of Desmond Miles through 3 different missions, all incredibly average, and honestly not very satisfying at all for a narrative many of us followed for 5 years if you played Assassin's Creed 1. So the good news is that the modern day doesn't constantly rip you out of the experience, but the bad news is there are missions you have to complete to progress through the story, and they are beyond boring, I've got to be honest. The length of Assassin's Creed 3 is pretty good, especially for the price point these days, but once again the pacing drags it down. I would have preferred an 8-hour quality story rather than a 15-hour story that's very inconsistent in its quality and tone. Really, without using too much of your time, the narrative is nowhere near the same quality of the Ezio trilogy due to fairly one-note characters like Charles Lee, but it could have been something far better than what it was due to the story they were trying to tell with Assassin's Creed 3. Attempting to deconstruct both Assassins and Templars to answer the question on who is right was a big risk, and unfortunately it just didn't work out, but the voice acting and overall presentation is great. But the pacing just dragged it down far too much, making the story way too slow to really stay invested in. So there are better Assassin's Creed games out there with far better stories and pacing. If you are enjoying this review, leave a like and consider sticking around by subscribing. Join the Discord if you want to get more involved with the community. Thanks guys for the support. So this is your standard Assassin's Creed gameplay on a new engine, as I already mentioned. So was there any improvements or has everything been made worse? Let's start with movement. Movement now only requires one button press, so you're basically always free running in this game, and it does make the game more fluid with more impressive animations. However, for whatever reason, the design of the world makes running down on the streets far quicker than traversing rooftops, along with the guards stopping you from using rooftops around every corner. What's the point of creating a free running system if you don't make it the most useful form of traversing? I'm so conflicted on it because the system overall is good and in some ways is an improvement on the old engine, but Ubisoft made it so difficult to actually use the system and eventually becomes useless. You will find yourself running through the streets far more often than climbing the buildings, which just shows the obvious flaws in the AI ruining the immersion. The old Assassin's Creed games had pretty terrible AI, but you could avoid being taken out of the game because you were traversing the rooftops away from the AI, but it just isn't the case here, so in my opinion traversal is a big downgrade. What about the open world itself? Well, unfortunately there is nothing to do. I mean, you could do the occasional homestead mission which is separate from the rest of the map, but that can be quite fun. But the rest of the missions are either find collectibles that unlock new side missions or do assassination contracts, which are far worse this time around, as it's just a random person minding their own business. It's not even designed like a mission, you just walk halfway across the map and stab a guy once, so it's incredibly boring. Now there is side content like the peg leg missions, which are honestly the best missions in the game, offering ship combat for the first time and actually having well designed interesting levels, and makes it very clear why you are doing those missions. That is a big thing, the lack of drive to finish missions. There is nothing worth buying with the currency you actually earn from these missions apart from slight outfit changes and the occasional weapon that doesn't affect combat at all. That's a good time to talk about combat. Combat here is gorgeous. The animations are great and the combat flows incredibly well, far better than any of the games using the Anvil Next engine, as it was clearly designed for the two weapon feel and the animations were specifically built for this game, which they then used for Black Flag and Rogue. Unfortunately, the game is just way too easy. The hardest part of Assassin's Creed 3 is dying. I am not joking. So the stakes just aren't there to give the exhilarating feel you want from a combat system, and it's just not here, but it really is gorgeous. There's 4 different variations of enemies, each just as easy to take out, and there is a serious lack of weapon variety. Either way, it doesn't matter if you use a sword, hidden blade, tomahawk, etc. They all do the same thing and not much else, and is seriously disappointing. But maybe the stealth saves the gameplay? Nope. Stealth is even worse this time around. No stealth but an inconsistent AI makes stealth an absolute chore, and it's probably the worst in the series, as the Anvil Next engine really doesn't work with stealth at all, and it is a shame because it's such a vital part of Assassin's Creed 3 and it just doesn't work. Tailing missions are back once again, and even worse than before, driving me up the wall, and it just gets unbearable at some parts. One tail took me almost 10 minutes to complete and was a bore fest.
My father was an assassin. Quite good. Built away. The guard is onto it.
Ship combat is terrific though. Obviously it was heavily improved in Assassin's Creed 4, but what's here is actually great, and probably the most fun I had in Assassin's Creed 3, and that speaks volumes. So if you want more Black Flag but haven't played AC3, it's here. It's not a lot, but it might be worth a $5 to experience, but then again, you have Assassin's Creed Rogue, which I heavily prefer, so that's up to you. I wish I wasn't being as negative as I am, but I have to be honest with you all, and I know this will annoy fans of the game, but Assassin's Creed 3 is just not a good Assassin's Creed game, and is not a good game in general. There is worse out there, but there is far better out there too. If you enjoy power trips, you should buy Assassin's Creed 3. If you want a challenging, well-paced experience, I don't think you should buy Assassin's Creed 3. Thank you for watching.